He introduced me to Christian, told me it was his best friend, and we invited him, come and have a drink with me and his accomplice, because I was friendly with his accomplice, who we took food to help him and his children. And then he started to cry and confess that he was going to get involved with Brueckner to take a child from Praia da Luz, which I just thought was, crazy to hear that. And he told me he'd done all the planning, Christian knew what he was doing, and I just said, you want to stay away from these people. Stay the hell out. And he cried that he needed the money to get out of this country with his children and his family. And that's why he was getting involved with Brueckner to steal a child.
A concrete slab poured in rural Algarve, just weeks after Madeleine McCann vanished, has become the centerpiece of one of the most disturbing theories surrounding her disappearance. According to British expat Ken Ralphs, the slab may conceal the 3-year-old's remains, hidden there after a chilling plan to abduct and sell a child to a desperate German couple collapsed under the glare of worldwide headlines. Ralphs claims a mutual acquaintance confessed, in tears by a campfire, that Christian Brueckner, the prime suspect, tried to recruit him for the plot. If true, this is not just another conspiracy, but a haunting possibility that Madeleine's fate lies beneath cement, ignored for nearly 2 decades. Yet without excavation, the theory hovers in the uneasy space between revelation and speculation. Among the many competing theories surrounding the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, few possess the same physical weight as the story of a slab of concrete poured in the Algarve countryside just weeks after she vanished. While most lines of inquiry hinge on memories, motives, or shifting narratives, this one stands on a literal foundation, a stretch of land, a layer of cement, and the unsettling possibility that beneath its surface lies the answer to a mystery that has endured for nearly 2 decades. Ken Ralphs, the British expatriate who has long claimed inside knowledge of Christian Brueckner's movements, insists that this slab is more than an abandoned construction project. For him, the chronology is too sharp to ignore. Madeleine disappeared on the evening of May 3, 2007. By mid to late May, heavy trucks and mixers rolled onto a parcel of land, roughly 2 to 3 miles from Praia da Luz, pouring a concrete base for a building that was never erected. In Ralphs's eyes, the alignment of dates forms the first red flag. The fact that the foundation has remained unused only deepens the unease. On its own, of course, the timing proves nothing. The Algarve was then a booming real estate zone, studded with half-finished developments and ambitious projects that collapsed as quickly as they began. A slab poured in spring 2007 could easily be just one of many casualties of shifting finance and failed planning permissions. Yet coincidence is precisely what criminals rely upon. To dismiss the overlap outright is to underestimate how concealment can blend seamlessly into the background noise of everyday life. Beyond the calendar lies the matter of proximity and connection. This particular land, according to Ralphs, was linked to an acquaintance of Brueckner. That claim does not automatically implicate anyone. Land may pass through many hands. Acquaintances are not accomplices, but it anchors the slab within Brueckner's social orbit. Criminal opportunity rarely emerges in total isolation. Offenders often seek out semi-private places where their presence can be explained. Helping a friend on a patch of property under development provides precisely that cover: access without suspicion, noise without secrecy, visibility disguised as normal construction. Whether that connection withstands scrutiny in land records and witness statements is another question. For now, it remains a possibility that complicates the otherwise mundane picture of an unfinished building. The logic of concealment under fresh concrete is compelling in its own right. Unlike a hasty burial in woods or fields, which can later betray itself through soil settling, animal disturbance, or vegetation patterns, a concrete pour locks the ground into permanence. The act itself provides camouflage. Trucks, digging, and disturbance are expected when laying foundations. A shallow pit dug hours earlier becomes invisible once cement hardens. For investigators, such concealment is doubly frustrating. It not only destroys traces of decomposition, but also demands invasive and costly excavation to test. This dual shield of normalization and permanence explains why Ralphs views the slab as the most plausible point of burial. if the plan to traffic Madeleine collapsed. Yet suspicion alone cannot substitute for evidence. One can point out how effective the tactic would have been, but one must also ask whether Brueckner or his circle had the means to execute it. Access to equipment, coordination with builders, and control over timing are not trivial matters. Was he sufficiently embedded in local networks to orchestrate such a move? Or does this line of reasoning overestimate his capacity and underestimate the messy realities of construction sites? These questions temper the neatness of the theory. Counter-arguments are not hard to muster. Southern Portugal is dotted with slabs that lead nowhere, the ghosts of an overheated property market that collapsed into the 2008 financial crisis. No cadaver dogs have publicly indicated decomposition at the site. No geophysical surveys have reported anomalies. No independent witnesses have placed Brueckner at the property during the crucial window. Without such supporting evidence, the slab hovers in a zone of suspicion, potent in symbolism, but fragile in proof. What makes the situation more fraught is investigative inertia. Ralphs has pressed the case for years, guiding journalists to the location, calling it the last property Brueckner stayed at before Madeleine vanished. Authorities, however, have declined to excavate. Their rationale is not necessarily indifference but legality. Excavating private property demands probable cause, and without corroborating evidence, judges are unlikely to authorize such disruption. Police, flooded with tips of varying quality, must triage. From their perspective, Ralphs' information is intriguing but insufficient. Yet by leaving the slab untouched, they allow speculation to fester. A simple core sample or radar scan could elevate the debate from rumor to result. The question then becomes one of thresholds. What level of evidence should trigger action? In theory, several types of data could tip the balance. An independent witness confirming suspicious activity on the land, forensic dogs reacting to the ground, remote sensing identifying cavities, or documents showing Brueckner's involvement in the pour. Any of these would move suspicion into the realm of probable cause. In their absence, the slab remains a ghostly possibility, visible, debated, but legally untouchable. The dilemma can be framed in terms of risk. If authorities excavate and find nothing, they risk wasted resources, media backlash, and diminished credibility. If they never excavate and the slab does conceal Madeleine's remains, they risk the gravest error of all: justice denied, evidence lost, history scarred by avoidable neglect. The first outcome is embarrassing, the second is unforgivable. This asymmetry explains Ralphs' relentless insistence that ignoring the slab is intolerable. From a law enforcement perspective, the calculus is less emotional and more bureaucratic, but the underlying stakes remain. In the end, the concrete slab symbolizes the entire McCann case, a physical fact loaded with interpretive uncertainty, a clue that could either collapse under scrutiny or append everything we think we know. To declare it the burial site without excavation would be reckless. To dismiss it as irrelevant without testing would be equally so. The only intellectually honest stance is to treat it as a hypothesis awaiting verification. Until radar scans sweep its surface, until core samples are pulled and analyzed, or until legal courage matches investigative logic, the slab will remain what it is today, a silent slab of stone, containing either nothing at all, or the truth the world has searched for since 2007. If the concrete slab offers a potential material trace, the Campfire confession offers its narrative counterpart, a story told in private, laden with emotion, and pointing directly to Christian Brueckner's alleged intentions. According to Ken Ralphs, this moment occurred about a week before Madeleine McCann disappeared. Around a fire in a makeshift camp, in the company of a few itinerants living off-grid in rural Algarve, a man known only as John broke down in tears and admitted that Brueckner had approached him with a plan. The scheme, he said, was not a ransom plot, but a targeted abduction of a wealthy family's child, with the aim of selling the victim to a German couple desperate to adopt. This account, if reliable, shifts the hypothesis from conjecture to premeditation. It transforms speculation about trafficking motives into a concrete claim that Brueckner articulated the plan in advance and sought an accomplice. Without John, the theory is circumstantial at best. With John, It becomes a potential statement against interest, a kind of indirect confession. Yet herein lies the dilemma. John has never reappeared, never given testimony to police, and may never be found. His existence, beyond Ralph's word, remains unverified. The emotional context of the confession is central to Ralph's retelling. John was portrayed as impoverished, living in a teepee with his wife and children, struggling to find a way out of Portugal. Alcohol flowed that night, and under its influence John allegedly wept, explaining that Brueckner had tempted him with money if he would participate. The image is powerful, a desperate man, caught between moral hesitation and financial need, confiding in a peer by the glow of a fire. For investigators, however, such a scene raises immediate questions. Alcohol impairs memory. Emotional storytelling can exaggerate or conflate. A confession without recording, corroboration, or follow-up risks becoming hearsay of the highest order. Still, even hearsay can matter if it contains details later borne out by independent evidence. Ralphs insists that John was clear about key elements. The plan was to abduct a child specifically from Praia da Luz. The target was to be from a wealthy foreign family, and the handoff was to a German couple unable to conceive. When Madeleine vanished days later, those details appeared to align uncannily. To Ralphs, the sequence was too neat to dismiss. The wealthy British family on holiday description mapped almost perfectly onto the McCann's. The proximity in time and place transformed John's words from idle drunken rambling into something darker. Yet investigators must weigh alternative explanations. People exaggerate. Campfire stories can take on a life of their own. Perhaps John repeated rumors circulating in Brueckner's circle, or spun a fantasy to gain sympathy from Ralph's. Perhaps his tears reflected despair over his own life, rather than guilt about any impending crime. Ralphs himself admits that he tried to dissuade John, even offering financial help, but John retired to bed without further discussion. That silence leaves open whether the confession was a momentary outpouring, never acted upon, or a genuine admission of complicity. The problem is compounded by John's disappearance. When Ralphs returned from England, after reporting his suspicions to police, he found that John's teepee had been burned down and the family was gone. Whether they fled, were intimidated, or simply moved on remains unknown. Their absence means the confession has never been tested under questioning, never subjected to cross-examination, never validated by additional witnesses. In legal terms, it is vapor. In investigative terms, it is a lead that evaporated before it could harden. Nevertheless, the confession's potential forensic value should not be understated. If John were located and confirmed his story under oath, it would constitute direct testimony of Brueckner's intent. It would establish premeditation, link the suspect to a trafficking motive, and potentially provide corroboration for the timeline. Even if John later retracted, the original statement could still pressure Brueckner in interrogation or be weighed against other evidence. In this sense, the Campfire confession represents a kind of Schrödinger's testimony, simultaneously powerful and powerless until the witness is observed again. One way to assess credibility is to compare the confession with what is known independently about Brueckner. His criminal record includes sexual assault, drug trafficking, and theft. He lived in a camper near Praia da Luz, knew the Ocean Club area, and had a reputation for opportunistic crimes. In that light, the idea of him plotting an abduction is not far-fetched. The trafficking angle, while less consistent with his prior offenses, cannot be excluded. John's alleged description of a German couple adds a detail that feels specific, though it might also be too conveniently dramatic. Was this specificity evidence of truth, or the hallmark of invention? Investigators cannot know without corroboration. Skeptics argue that Ralphs himself may have embellished or misremembered John's words. Memory degrades, and retelling hardens narrative. The fact that Ralphs has repeated the same story over years could reflect consistency or rehearsed myth. Supporters counter that his consistency is precisely the point. He has never deviated, never added sensational embellishments beyond the original Campfire account. That steadiness, they argue, signals sincerity. Again, the truth lies in uncertainty. The real issue is structural. Law enforcement agencies often struggle to integrate off-grid witnesses into formal investigations. Marginal communities generate leads. But those leads are difficult to verify. Individuals vanish across borders, live without documents, and resist authority. John's disappearance fits this pattern. Without systems to trace transient populations, police were left with Ralph's lone testimony, which they apparently classified as off interest but insufficient. From their perspective, acting on it without further proof risked wasting resources or derailing the main case. In the spectrum of evidence, the Campfire confession sits somewhere between rumor and testimony, balanced precariously. It cannot be dismissed outright, for its details align too closely with later events. Nor can it be accepted without question, for it lacks the procedural safeguards of sworn witness statements. The only intellectually honest stance is to recognize its conditional value, powerful if verified, inert if not, until John is found, or definitively shown never to have existed. The confession will remain suspended, a story that could either expose the machinery of abduction for sale or dissolve as one man's drunken lament. Thus, the Campfire confession is both the most tantalizing and the most fragile component of Ken Rolfe's hypothesis. If the Campfire confession set the stage for a planned abduction for sale, the days and hours that followed Madeleine's disappearance illustrate why such a plan, if it ever existed, could never have succeeded. Within minutes of her absence being discovered at the Ocean Club, the alarm spread from the holiday complex to the Portuguese police, and within hours it began rippling into the international press. By the next morning, May 4th, the story was already attracting widespread attention. For traffickers seeking to deliver a child discreetly into the custody of paying adoptive parents, this was catastrophic. Any transfer attempt in that climate would have risked exposure, arrest, and collapse of the entire operation. Criminal markets thrive on opacity. An abducted child can be moved across borders, handed to intermediaries, and assimilated into fraudulent paperwork so long as the case remains local and underreported. But Madeleine's disappearance instantly transcended local boundaries. As a British citizen missing abroad, her case carried diplomatic weight. The involvement of two governments, Portugal and the United Kingdom, magnified scrutiny. With Interpol notices and border alerts, the environment for smuggling a 3-year-old blonde girl into a new identity narrowed to the vanishing point. In other words, if Brueckner or his associates intended to profit from selling her, the opportunity window closed almost as soon as it opened. This logic of collapse is reinforced by the psychology of risk. The moment her photograph appeared on international news, any illicit buyer would recoil. Even if a German couple had been willing to pay for a child, they would have recognized the insanity of proceeding with a transaction involving Europe's most recognizable missing face. The pressure on them would not only be legal but social. Discovery would mean not merely prosecution but lifelong stigma. Rational actors in such a market prefer anonymity, not notoriety. In this sense, the very intensity of public attention created a self-canceling dynamic. The more the media screamed her name, the less feasible a clandestine sale became. If one accepts this reasoning, the conclusion follows with unsettling logic. When the trafficking channel collapses, those in possession of the child face a brutal choice. Releasing her would invite capture, transporting her under the glare of alerts would be suicidal, holding her alive indefinitely would create ongoing risk. The grim alternative is elimination. In Ralph's hypothesis, that elimination was achieved swiftly, followed by disposal under concrete. From the standpoint of criminal rationality, killing is framed not as cruelty for its own sake, but as risk management. To outside observers this seems monstrous, and it is, but in the cold arithmetic of crime, it may have felt like the only viable exit once the plan imploded. Yet here one must tread carefully. This chain of reasoning, though tidy, is speculative. It presumes that a sale plan existed, that a buyer was waiting, and that the perpetrators panicked when publicity rose. Each link rests on unverified assumptions. There is no documentary evidence of negotiations with a couple, no intercepted communications, no financial trails pointing to a transaction. The entire edifice stands on the initial Campfire story, filtered through Ralph's. From a skeptical perspective, the collapse scenario may simply be an ex post facto rationalization, explaining why Madeleine vanished without trace by hypothesizing a market that never truly existed. Still, the power of the hypothesis lies in its explanatory reach. Why was no ransom demand ever made? Why was there never a credible sighting of Madeleine in underground adoption networks? Why did Brueckner's name continue to surface in police investigations despite lack of proof? The trafficking collapse to murder sequence answers these questions with one coherent narrative. It accounts for the silence after May 3rd, the absence of negotiation, and the need for quick disposal. While not evidence in itself, it provides an internally consistent model against which investigators can test data. The type of data needed to strengthen or weaken this model is clear. Cell tower records from Brueckner's phone, mapped against the hours and days after Madeleine vanished, could reveal frantic movement consistent with disposal rather than long-term custody. Communications between Brueckner and his known associates, if recoverable, might show whether contacts with potential buyers were abruptly cut. Vehicle traces, fuel purchases, or surveillance footage could point to whether he attempted long-distance transport and abandoned it once publicity grew. At present, such forensic reconstruction remains fragmentary, leaving the model in the realm of hypothesis rather than proof. There is also the matter of human behavior under pressure. Criminals do not always act with perfect rationality. Panic can lead to mistakes, improvisation, or even abandonment of original plans. It is conceivable that Madeleine's disappearance was accidental or opportunistic, not pre-planned, and that Brueckner, if involved, never had a sale in mind. In that case, the collapse of a trafficking channel would be irrelevant because it never existed. Even so, the coincidence of timing is difficult to ignore. The disappearance of a wealthy tourist child in a resort town was bound to draw maximum visibility. For any criminal enterprise predicated on invisibility, the alarm was a death blow. This is why Ralph stresses that the Campfire confession cannot be isolated from what happened after. John's story about an abduction for sale might otherwise sound fanciful. When combined with the instant global spotlight, it becomes tragically plausible. Not certain, but plausible enough to demand consideration. In the end, the point of collapse is less a statement of fact than a framework of probability. If one accepts that Brueckner had conceived a trafficking plan, then the only logical outcome after May 3rd was its implosion. If one doubts that such a plan ever existed, then the collapse scenario dissolves into narrative convenience. The truth remains obscured by the absence of corroborating records. What is left is a razor's edge of inference. Either Madeleine was destined for sale, but became unmarketable under global scrutiny, or the very idea of sale is a retrospective construction layered onto an otherwise opaque crime. Thus, the collapse hypothesis illustrates both the strength and the weakness of the Ralph's narrative. It offers a clear, grimly logical explanation for why Madeleine was never found in illegal adoption networks, why no buyer ever emerged, why silence followed the abduction. But it also highlights how fragile the case remains without data on movements, calls, or accomplices. Until those gaps are filled, the collapse will remain not a certainty but a possibility, haunting, coherent, yet unproven. When assessing Ken Ralph's claim that Christian Brueckner sought to abduct a child in order to sell her to a childless couple, one objection is raised almost immediately. Such things might happen in fragile states, but surely not in Europe. The data, however, tell a more nuanced story. While outright abduction to adoption pipelines are not documented in Western Europe with the same scale as in South Asia or Africa, children remain disproportionately represented in trafficking statistics across both Europe and the Americas. And hidden within these statistics are documented cases of illicit adoptions, falsified paperwork, and networks exploiting loopholes in family law. The pattern is rarer in affluent regions, but it exists. This is enough to move Ralph's hypothesis out of the realm of impossibility and into the realm of potential. According to the European Parliamentary Research Service, children represented about 19% of all identified trafficking victims within the European Union during 2021 to 2022. Strikingly, 81% of those trafficked children were EU citizens themselves, and 88% were exploited within their own country rather than being transported abroad. This undermines the assumption that trafficking is always an whom-ported crime. In reality, exploitation of minors often takes place in domestic contexts, where systems of oversight are presumed to be strongest. The presence of child victims inside the EU indicates vulnerabilities that traffickers can exploit, even without international networks. The global picture reinforces this point. UNODC reported in 2022 that children accounted for 38% of all detected trafficking victims worldwide, a dramatic increase compared to prior decades. Reuters' coverage of the report emphasized the surge following the COVID-19 pandemic, noting that economic instability had intensified vulnerabilities among minors. If nearly 4 in 10 identified victims are children, then the idea of a child being targeted in Portugal in 2007 is not absurd. It is statistically consistent with global patterns of exploitation, even in regions with stricter legal frameworks. National-level figures add further weight. In the Netherlands, one of Europe's most regulated legal systems, between 2018 and 2022 over 700 trafficking victims were identified annually. About 10% were children and 60% were women. Romania, often a source and transit country within Europe, reported 2613 identified victims between 2016 and 2019. Of these, roughly 50% were children and 75% were female. These figures confirm that in the European context, children are not only incidental victims, but sometimes the majority in certain categories of trafficking. Their exploitation takes many forms: sexual abuse, forced begging, domestic servitude, and while illegal adoption is harder to quantify, it sits within the same ecosystem. The Americas reveal similar vulnerabilities. In Guatemala, nearly the entire set of identified trafficking victims in 2018 were minors. Of 316 victims, 292 were children. The numbers are startling, because they suggest that in some regions of Latin America, children are disproportionately the prime commodity of trafficking. Mexico's notorious Casitas del Sur scandal also illustrates how shelters and adoption frameworks can be infiltrated. Dozens of children disappeared from care homes, later believed to have been placed through irregular adoption or handed to families under opaque arrangements. In the United States, trafficking for adoption has surfaced through scandals such as the Paul Peterson case. Peterson, a former county official, orchestrated an illegal adoption scheme involving women from the Marshall Islands, manipulating residency papers and facilitating illicit transfers of newborns to adoptive families in the U.S. The court concluded that this amounted to fraud and, effectively, the sale of children under cover of international adoption. While Peterson's case did not involve kidnapping, it proved how fertile the adoption space can be for exploitation when desperate parents, loose regulations, and money intersect. Likewise, after the 2010 Haiti earthquake, American missionaries were arrested for attempting to move children out of Haiti without proper documentation. Many of the children were later revealed not to be orphans at all. The line between humanitarian rescue and illicit removal blurred, highlighting how fragile circumstances can turn into opportunities for child transfer without consent. Even within Europe itself, cases exist that echo the mechanics of Ralph's hypothesis. The 2013 Blonde Angel case in Greece, where a young girl was found living with a Roma couple using falsified documents, sparked concerns about illicit adoption rings operating under the radar. Investigations later suggested that paperwork fraud and child placements may have been more common than official statistics revealed. Europol, too, has broken up groups involved in arranging illegal adoptions and surrogacies, including trafficking of women for eggs and infants for sale. These investigations show that while rare, the concept of children being commodified for family formation is not alien to European soil. To be clear, none of these examples prove that Brueckner had a functioning adoption pipeline in the Algarve. They do, however, erode the claim that Ralph's theory is inherently fanciful. If children are consistently a large share of trafficking victims in Europe, if Guatemala can report a near-total dominance of minors among trafficked persons, if adoption scams can unfold in the United States and Greece, then the possibility that a trafficker in Portugal might view selling a child as a viable option cannot be dismissed on grounds of implausibility alone. What these cases collectively demonstrate is a spectrum of exploitation. At one end, systemic networks, like those seen in Latin America, produce children for illegal adoption at scale. At the other, ad hoc opportunistic schemes, like Peterson's in Arizona or the Blonde Angel case in Greece, show how individual actors can manipulate systems to transfer children improperly. The Algarve in 2007 would likely fall into the latter category, not a systemic pipeline but a potential one-off arrangement, an improvised attempt to satisfy demand through personal contacts. Of course, plausibility is not proof. In the European setting, the barriers are higher: stringent adoption laws, cross-border treaties, and heavy scrutiny from central authorities. To turn a kidnapped child into a legally recognized adoptee in Germany would require elaborate falsification. The lack of evidence that Brueckner had such connections is a serious gap. This is why Ralph's hypothesis cannot be treated as established fact. The numbers show that children are heavily targeted across continents. The cases show that illicit adoption exists even in Western legal systems. But the bridge from those generalities to Madeleine's specific case has yet to be built. The cautious conclusion is that Ralph's theory fits within a known global pattern. Children are trafficked in Europe and the Americas. Some are exploited for sex, some for labor, some through the gray zone of illegal adoption. It is not common, but it is real. In this light, the idea that Madeleine could have been targeted for sale is not inherently absurd. It is a possibility consistent with what the world has already witnessed. Rare, difficult, but conceivable. And until investigators either prove or disprove it with material evidence, it remains a hypothesis suspended between probability and doubt. Its plausibility shaped by global precedent, but unanswered in the Algarve itself. Any serious consideration of Ken Ralph's hypothesis eventually converges on Christian Brueckner himself. The man at the center of so many suspicions is not a blank canvas. He carries a criminal history that maps disturbingly well onto the requirements of an abduction plot. His past crimes, his mobility, and his proximity to Praia da Luz all combine to create a portrait of someone who, at the very least, could have carried out such a plan. But capability is not the same as culpability, and the leap from possibility to fact requires more than inference. Brueckner's record is a litany of offenses across categories: drug trafficking, theft, burglary, fraud, sexual assault, and crimes against children. German police files describe him as a serial offender from his teenage years, with arrests spanning multiple jurisdictions. His conviction for the rape of a 72-year-old woman in Praia da Luz in 2005 demonstrated both his presence in the area and his willingness to commit extreme violence. His later convictions for child abuse cemented his reputation as a predator. For investigators, these facts establish a grim baseline. If one were to imagine a profile of someone capable of abducting and disposing of a child, Brueckner unfortunately fits. The logistical side of Ralph's hypothesis also aligns with Brueckner's lifestyle. He lived off-grid for long stretches, parking campervans along beaches, and in rural areas, maintaining a degree of invisibility by drifting between communities. Such mobility, while normal for many expatriates in southern Portugal, also offered the perfect cover for illicit activity. A campervan provides both transport and temporary concealment, giving an offender the ability to move quickly without attracting the scrutiny that a permanent residence might invite. His ability to vanish from one site and appear in another mirrors the skill set required for trafficking or clandestine disposal. Ralphs himself emphasized that he met Brueckner through this off-grid world, at markets and gatherings of itinerants. Their mutual connection, John, lived in a teepee and struggled financially. Brueckner's recruitment of John, if true, fits a familiar criminal pattern, exploiting the vulnerable. A man desperate for money and with few legitimate options is easier to tempt with illicit profit. If Brueckner was indeed plotting an abduction for sale, enlisting an accomplice like John would have been consistent with his opportunistic modus operandi. The question of motive is equally unsettling. Money is an obvious incentive. Brueckner's history of drug trafficking and theft shows a man comfortable with illegal revenue streams. The suggestion that he could earn thousands by delivering a child to a waiting couple fits this pattern. Beyond financial gain, there is the darker possibility of sexual motivation. His convictions for child abuse and possession of abusive images make it plausible that his interest in Madeleine, or in children generally, was not merely transactional. Ralph's hypothesis emphasizes the adoption for sale angle, but some investigators suspect that Brueckner's ultimate motive may have been sexual exploitation, with the German couple story functioning as cover. Either way, the motive exists, whether greed, compulsion, or a toxic combination of both. Still, could have, is not, did. Criminal history can establish predisposition, but it cannot substitute for evidence. Countless offenders have the means and motive to commit crimes they never carry out. Brueckner's record may make him a credible suspect, but it does not automatically make him guilty in this specific case. This distinction matters, because the temptation to align all suspicious facts into a narrative can obscure the absence of hard proof. Consider the element of opportunity. On the night Madeleine disappeared, Brueckner's phone was logged in the vicinity of Praia da Luz. That data point places him in the zone, but not in the apartment. Hundreds of others were in the same area. Opportunity is about more than geography, it requires access. Did Brueckner have the knowledge to identify the McCann's apartment, to know the children were alone, and to strike at the right moment? Some evidence suggests he had worked casually in the Ocean Club area, possibly giving him familiarity with the resort. But casual knowledge is not the same as surveillance. Whether he specifically targeted Madeleine or acted on chance remains unproven. Another challenge is the absence of corroborating witnesses. John's alleged confession to Ralph's implies Brueckner was recruiting, but John himself vanished. No third party has stepped forward to confirm Brueckner's discussions of child trafficking. No financial transactions have surfaced to show payment for a child. No forged documents, no travel arrangements, no false passports have been tied to him. The entire narrative rests on the alignment of his background with Ralph's testimony. It is a suggestive match, but not a conclusive one. Nevertheless, Brueckner's profile keeps him at the center of the case. Prosecutors in Germany continue to name him as the prime suspect, even as they admit they lack enough evidence to charge him. That persistence suggests investigators view his means, motive, and opportunity as stronger than those of any other suspect. They may not be ready to prove it in court, but they are unwilling to dismiss him. This institutional fixation is itself a form of circumstantial reinforcement. Where there is sustained smoke, one suspect's fire, even if the flames are not yet visible. For Ralph's, the alignment of Brueckner's life with the requirements of the hypothesis is precisely why he insists on further investigation. The man had the criminal versatility to orchestrate an abduction, the mobility to transport a child, the connections to enlist help, the motive to profit, and the presence in Praia da Luz at the crucial time. To Ralph's, the missing piece is not plausibility but proof. Digging the concrete slab, finding John, or recovering communications could elevate Brueckner from could have to did. Until then, the gap remains. In summary, Christian Brueckner represents the archetype of a suspect who embodies means, motive, and opportunity. His criminal record supplies the means. His financial instability and sexual deviance supply the motive. His proximity to the Ocean Club supplies the opportunity. Yet the combination, while troubling, is not conclusive. Without physical evidence or corroborating witnesses, the case against him remains probabilistic rather than demonstrative. For now, he is less the proven perpetrator than the suspect, whose profile refuses to let go of the narrative. A man who could have done it, who may have done it, but whose guilt remains shrouded in the same uncertainty that has haunted this case for nearly 2 decades. No element of the Ralph's hypothesis can be evaluated without first asking, how much weight does Ralph's himself deserve? His credibility is the fulcrum on which the entire theory rests. Unlike forensic traces or documented financial flows, his contribution is essentially testimonial. He claims to have heard a confession, to have identified a location, and to have reported it to authorities. If he is reliable, then his narrative becomes a crucial lead. If he is embellishing or misremembering, then the foundation of the theory weakens drastically. The difficulty is that Ralph's life provides arguments for both sides of the debate, reasons to view him as a trustworthy whistleblower, and reasons to doubt his impartiality. The first argument in favor of Ralph's reliability lies in his biography. Born in England, he had an established life before being forced into exile. He was once a politically active community figure, engaged with law enforcement in efforts to combat crime. That history suggests a man familiar with civic duty and not naturally inclined to fabricate allegations against strangers. His eventual move to Portugal came not from a desire to disappear into fantasy, but from fear and retaliation. After cooperating with police in a murder investigation in the UK, his name was leaked, and he was violently targeted by criminal gangs. His food truck business was destroyed, his family threatened, and he eventually sued the police for negligence, winning compensation and using it to start a new life abroad. This background demonstrates both his willingness to step forward as a witness and the heavy personal cost of doing so. It adds plausibility to the idea that he might again speak up when confronted with a disturbing story, even at risk to himself. His relocation to Portugal placed him in the off-grid expatriate community of the Algarve, a milieu that mixed surfers, travelers, idealists, and petty criminals. It was here that he encountered Christian Brueckner and, crucially, John. Ralphs describes himself as careful in this environment, cautious about whom he trusted, but still integrated enough to hear confidences. The fact that he consistently names the Campfire confession as the turning point suggests an anchor point in his memory. He has repeated the same details over the years without major embellishment. The timing in late April 2007, John's tears, the promise that the child would not be harmed, the lure of money to rescue John's family from poverty. The consistency of this retelling is striking in a world where rumor often morphs. Supporters of Ralph's argue that his consistency is evidence of sincerity. He has never sought to expand his claims into elaborate conspiracy theories, never shifted his story to match media narratives, and never added sensational extras. His account has remained narrow, almost stubbornly so. Moreover, he took the practical step of reporting his suspicions multiple times, first in 2007 to police in Cumbria, again in 2020 when Brueckner was publicly named, and again in 2022 in correspondence with German prosecutors. These actions suggest not a man seeking notoriety, but someone frustrated that his warnings were ignored. His repeated efforts to channel information through official channels reinforce the image of a whistleblower rather than a fantasist. Yet skepticism persists, and not without reason. The very qualities that make Ralphs an appealing witness also create doubts. He is, after all, an outsider, a British expatriate living among drifters, telling a story that no one else has corroborated. John disappeared before police could verify his existence. The secret map Ralphs provided to British police has never yielded results. Authorities in Germany and the UK acknowledge receiving his tips, but classify them as information of interest, rather than hard intelligence. If his leads were truly compelling, why have they not produced results? The absence of tangible follow-up erodes confidence. There is also the possibility of unconscious embellishment. Memory is fallible, particularly when events are emotionally charged and retold over years. Ralphs admits alcohol was involved in the Campfire scene. Could he have misinterpreted John's drunken words, projecting coherence onto a fragmentary conversation? Could his conviction that Brueckner was a dangerous man have retroactively colored his interpretation of those words once Madeleine disappeared? Human psychology makes such distortions entirely possible. Critics also raise the specter of self-interest. Though Ralphs has not profited materially from his claims, attention is its own currency. Being the man with the inside story in Europe's most notorious missing child case brings a degree of recognition. For some, that recognition might motivate embellishment. To Ralphs's credit, he has largely avoided the media circus, but his statements have nonetheless been quoted widely. Distinguishing between genuine moral urgency and a subtle desire for relevance is difficult. The only responsible way to frame Ralphs is as a witness of conditional reliability. His background and persistence justify taking his information seriously. His lack of corroboration and the disappearance of John demand caution. His story cannot be accepted as fact, but neither can it be written off. The appropriate investigative stance is trust, but verify. to recognize the value of his account while insisting on material evidence before drawing conclusions. This is why Ralphs himself has repeatedly called for excavation of the concrete slab. He understands that his credibility alone is insufficient. He seeks the external proof that could vindicate or invalidate him. In the end, Ken Ralphs stands as a reminder of the fragility of witness testimony in cases defined by absence. He could be the man who carried the critical truth for 18 years, unheard. He could also be a man who misheard, misremembered, or misinterpreted a drunken confession. His life story, marked by betrayal, exile, and survival, makes both possibilities believable. What cannot be denied is that his voice has shaped the trajectory of the case. Whether history will remember him as a whistleblower vindicated or a storyteller mistaken depends not on his words, but on the evidence that may yet emerge. Until then, he remains a witness in the gray zone, the embodiment of a hypothesis that lives or dies by the test of proof. The persistence of Ken Ralphs's hypothesis raises an uncomfortable question. If there really is a concrete slab that could contain Madeleine McCann's remains, and if Ralphs reported it multiple times to authorities, why has it never been dug up? The answer lies not in a single decision, but in the complex intersection of legal thresholds, institutional caution, resource allocation, and political sensitivity. Law enforcement has acknowledged Ralphs's information repeatedly, but acknowledgement has not translated into decisive action. Understanding why requires peeling back the layers of how major investigations operate, and why leads, however dramatic, can languish untested. Ralphs's timeline of reports is well documented. In May 2007, immediately after hearing of Madeleine's disappearance while visiting his father in England, he drove to a police station in Cumbria to give a statement. He described John's confession by the campfire and provided a hand-drawn, secret map of the teepee settlement where John had lived. He urged that this information be passed to Portuguese authorities. Yet when he returned to Portugal weeks later, the site was gone, the teepee burned, and no clear sign that police had pursued the lead. Whether the map was ignored, lost in bureaucratic translation, or deemed too weak remains unknown. Over a decade later, when Brueckner was named as a prime suspect in 2020, Ralphs resurfaced with the same information. He again pressed the case, pointing to the land with the concrete slab as the logical burial site. In 2022, he wrote directly to German prosecutor Hans Christian Wolters, providing a more detailed statement. Wolters confirmed receipt and investigators interviewed Ralphs, but again no excavation followed. By June 2025, when German and Portuguese police conducted a highly publicized search of 120 acres near Praia da Luz, Ralphs's frustration boiled over. He argued that the search was in the wrong place, that investigators had avoided the precise slab he had highlighted. When the search ended after only 3 days, producing no conclusive evidence, Ralphs accused authorities of deliberately missing the point. From Ralphs's perspective, the refusal to test the slab is baffling, even negligent. But from a law enforcement perspective, the calculus looks different. Excavating private property in Europe requires a warrant supported by probable cause. Courts demand more than suspicion or hearsay, they require corroboration. A confession retold by a third party does not meet that standard. Without independent evidence linking the site to Brueckner, such as witness statements, forensic anomalies, or documentary records, police risk having warrants denied. Even if granted, digging up land and destroying a structure without strong justification could expose authorities to liability if nothing is found. The financial and reputational stakes also weigh heavily. The McCann case has already consumed tens of millions of pounds and euros, with Operation Grange in the UK alone costing over £13 million. Each failed search sheets headlines about wasted money and mismanagement. Politicians overseeing police budgets are wary of authorizing yet another speculative dig based on a tip from a single expatriate witness. They know that if the excavation produces nothing, they will be accused of chasing ghosts. In this light, caution is not necessarily incompetence, but political survival. There is also the matter of investigative hierarchy. Police receive thousands of tips in high-profile cases. Each must be triaged, sorted into credible, weak, and not actionable. Ralph's story, consistent but uncorroborated, has remained stuck between categories. It is not dismissed outright. Prosecutors confirm it has been logged, but it is not elevated to top priority either. From the outside, this looks like negligence. From the inside, it reflects a system where finite manpower must focus on leads that can produce immediate results. Yet the lack of follow-up creates a paradox. By failing to test the slab, investigators leave Ralph's story alive. As long as the site remains untouched, the possibility lingers. A negative result could have closed the door. The absence of a result keeps it open. This dynamic fuels suspicion that authorities are deliberately avoiding the truth. Ralphs himself accuses them of political cowardice, suggesting that no agency wants to be responsible for confirming or disproving his claim, because either outcome would be explosive. A discovery would expose years of failure, and a negative result would expose years of wasted speculation. Another explanation is bureaucratic diffusion of responsibility. The McCann case spans 3 jurisdictions: Portugal, Germany, and the UK. Each has an interest, but none has absolute authority. When Ralphs reported to Cumbria Police in 2007, they passed the information to Portuguese authorities, but once transferred, accountability blurred. When he wrote to German prosecutors in 2022, they acknowledged his input, but relied on Portuguese partners for ground searches. Scotland Yard's Operation Grange, meanwhile, operates within the UK's legal boundaries and cannot authorize digs abroad. In this triangular arrangement, each agency can point to the others, and action stalls in the gaps. The opacity of investigative files compounds the uncertainty. Much of what authorities know remains classified. They may already have scanned the slab with ground-penetrating radar and found nothing. But without public disclosure, outsiders cannot know. They may have dismissed Ralph's map after discovering discrepancies in John's identity. They may have evidence that contradicts his account, but confidentiality prevents them from saying so. Until those files are opened, if ever, the public is left to speculate. There is also the uncomfortable possibility of cognitive bias. Once an investigation develops a primary theory, alternative leads tend to receive less attention. Since 2020, German prosecutors have focused on proving Brueckner's guilt through digital records, witness testimony, and circumstantial links to Praia da Luz. Their narrative frames him as the lone offender motivated by sexual predation, not by trafficking. In that frame, Ralph's adoption for sale theory feels like a distraction. Investigators may subconsciously downgrade it, not because it is disproven, but because it does not fit their working hypothesis. This tunnel vision is a well-known hazard in long cases. So why has Ralph's hypothesis not been fully tested? The most likely answer is a combination: insufficient legal threshold, fear of political fallout, limited resources, and institutional inertia. Each factor alone might be overcome. Together they create paralysis. What looks from the outside like avoidance may from the inside be a rational, if frustrating, allocation of risk. Yet this pragmatic caution carries its own dangers. If the slab does contain Madeleine's remains, then failing to investigate would be one of the gravest errors in modern policing, a truth buried not only in concrete, but under layers of bureaucracy. Ultimately, the certainty of why authorities have hesitated will only emerge if investigative records are ever declassified. Until then, speculation is unavoidable. Perhaps Ralph's theory is too weak. Perhaps it is too politically costly. Or perhaps it is correct, and the failure to act has prolonged the world's most famous missing child mystery. The line between prudence and negligence is thin, and without transparency, it is impossible to know on which side the investigators truly stand. Few elements of the Ralph's hypothesis have drawn as much attention as the reaction it provoked in the public sphere. From the moment journalists reported his story, that a man living off-grid in Portugal claimed Christian Brueckner had tried to recruit an accomplice to abduct a child, the case fractured into 2 competing narratives. For some, Ralph's was the whistleblower who had revealed what investigators had long ignored, a man providing the missing piece that could finally explain Madeleine McCann's disappearance. For others, he was at best a misguided storyteller, at worst a self-promoter spinning a fantasy into headlines. This polarity reflects not only the contested nature of his claims, but also the way modern media, particularly social platforms, amplify both belief and skepticism into hardened camps. Supporters of Ralph's describe his account as an explosive revelation. Their argument is simple. His narrative fits too neatly with what is known about Brueckner and the timeline to be coincidence. The detail that a German suspect allegedly sought to sell a child to a German couple resonates with broader concerns about trafficking networks. The timing of John's confession, only a week before Madeleine vanished, lends it eerie prescience. These supporters often highlight that Ralphs has been consistent in retelling his story, resisting the temptation to embellish. They point to the fact that investigators eventually conducted searches in the Algarve in 2025 as tacit acknowledgement that his information cannot be dismissed outright. To them, Ralphs represents the archetypal ignored witness, the man shouting truth into the void while bureaucracies turn away. On the other side stand the skeptics, equally vocal. They dismiss Ralphs as a storyteller, weaving campfire anecdotes into a pseudo-theory that distracts from serious investigation. They argue that no corroboration has ever emerged for John's existence, that Ralphs's secret map produced nothing, and that police across 3 countries have consistently declined to act on his tips. To them, the absence of concrete evidence is proof of fabrication. Some critics go further, accusing Ralphs of exploiting the tragedy for attention, deliberately inserting himself into the world's most notorious missing child case to gain relevance. For this camp, every repetition of his account is a reminder of how rumor metastasizes into folklore when tragedy leaves a vacuum. What complicates this binary is the ecosystem of alternative theories surrounding the McCann case. For nearly 2 decades, speculation has ranged from the plausible to the outlandish. Some insist Madeleine died accidentally in the apartment and her parents covered it up. Others claim a botched burglary led to her disappearance. More extreme theories involve governmental conspiracies, staged abductions, or elite trafficking rings. Against this cacophony, Ralphs's hypothesis occupies an ambiguous space. It is more grounded than conspiracies about staged photos or political cover-ups, yet less conventional than theories centered on parental negligence or opportunistic assault. Its placement in the middle ground ensures both traction and attack, credible enough to alarm, unproven enough to doubt. The role of social media cannot be overstated. Platforms like Twitter, now X, thrive on polarities. Short bursts of outrage or affirmation turn nuanced theories into slogans. Posts amplifying Ralphs's claim often feature phrases like explosive revelation or bombshell confession, framing his account as the breakthrough investigators refuse to confront. Critics respond with equally blunt dismissals. Lear, fantasist, nothing but a storyteller. The result is an echo chamber where Ralphs's hypothesis is simultaneously canonized and ridiculed, with little room for middle ground assessments of conditional plausibility. For investigators, this polarization is double-edged. On one hand, public pressure can push agencies to re-examine leads. The June 2025 search in the Algarve, while not directly targeting Ralphs's Slab, unfolded in a climate where his allegations had gone viral. On the other hand, public division complicates their work. Each move is scrutinized, each decision to dig or not dig interpreted as proof of either conspiracy or incompetence. Law enforcement operates under legal thresholds, but the court of public opinion demands action on suspicion alone. Ralphs's story thus becomes less an evidentiary lead than a cultural symbol of distrust between citizens and institutions. The sociology of such debates matters because they reveal not whether a hypothesis is true, but how truth is contested. Ralphs's account functions as what scholars call a social fact. Its existence shapes discourse regardless of its veracity. Even if proven false tomorrow, the mere presence of his story has altered the landscape of the case. It has inspired searches, generated headlines, and provided a focal point for frustration at investigative inertia. There is also a psychological dimension to the divide. Supporters of Ralphs are often motivated by distrust of institutions. To them, the fact that police have not excavated the slab is not evidence of weakness in his story, but evidence of systemic cover-up or incompetence. Their belief in Ralphs is an extension of their skepticism toward authority. Conversely, detractors may view adherence to procedural rigor as a safeguard against sensationalism. For them, rejecting Ralphs is less about disproving him and more about affirming the primacy of evidence over anecdote. The debate thus maps onto broader cultural tensions between grassroots testimony and institutional authority, between suspicion and skepticism, between emotion and procedure. The existence of competing theories further complicates this dynamic. For example, those who believe the McCanns themselves were involved see Ralphs' story as a distraction designed to exonerate them. Others who accept Brueckner as the prime suspect but favor a sexual assault motive regard the trafficking for sale theory as unnecessary elaboration. Each faction interprets Ralphs not on his own terms, but through the lens of their preferred narrative. This selective integration ensures that his hypothesis is perpetually contested, never achieving consensus. From an analytical standpoint, the lesson is clear: public reception of Ralphs' claims does not prove or disprove them. Ralphs' story thrives not because it has been confirmed, but because it is coherent, dramatic, and unresolved. What does this mean for the case itself? Practically, very little. Investigations are not swayed by hashtags. Courts do not accept retweets as evidence. But symbolically, it means that Ralphs' hypothesis will not vanish until it is definitively disproved. In the end, the public debate around Ralphs' hypothesis reveals more about the nature of modern information flows than about Madeleine's fate. His story exemplifies how a single anecdote, repeated consistently, can polarize opinion, generate media coverage, and pressure institutions without ever crossing the threshold of proof. Whether Ralphs is a whistleblower or a storyteller is, for the moment, less significant than the fact that millions of people have already chosen their answer. Until material evidence emerges, either confirming his fears or disproving them, the divide will persist, amplified by every algorithm and every headline. The hypothesis thus lives not only in investigative files, but in the contested space of collective imagination, sustained by belief and disbelief in equal measure. After nearly 2 decades of speculation, what stands out about the Ralphs hypothesis is not that it has been proven nor that it has been disproven, but that it has lingered. The durability of an idea often says something about its architecture. Weak theories collapse under scrutiny, while resilient ones survive precisely because they contain enough coherence to resist dismissal. Ralphs' account occupies that middle ground. It is too consistent to ignore, too fragile to accept, and therefore remains alive in a state of investigative limbo. To move beyond impasse, it is necessary to weigh the hypothesis as a whole, its internal strengths, its undeniable weaknesses, and the implications of leaving it unresolved. The strongest argument in its favor is its alignment with known facts about Christian Brueckner. His history of sexual offenses, drug trafficking, and burglary provides a profile consistent with someone capable of abducting a child. His presence in Praia da Luz at the relevant time, confirmed by mobile phone data, places him within the circle of opportunity. His lifestyle within the off-grid expatriate community explains how he could have encountered John and how conversations about illicit schemes might plausibly have occurred. For those inclined to see coherence, these elements form a constellation. A dangerous man in the right place, at the right time, with the right kind of connections. Equally persuasive is the way Ralphs' narrative fits the timeline. The confession he recalls took place in late April 2007. Days later, Madeleine vanished. If one were fabricating after the fact, the temptation would be to create elaborate detail or connect dots too neatly. Ralphs, by contrast, has repeated the same sparse account without expansion: an offer to John, a plan to sell a child to a German couple, tears by a campfire. The very economy of the story gives it weight, and when the disappearance occurred within days, the coincidence became, in his mind, confirmation. Even if coincidence, it is an unusually sharp one. Then there is the material anchor, the concrete slab. In a case where so many theories are abstract, the slab is tangible. It can be touched, photographed, measured, excavated. It either contains something, or it does not. Its existence prevents the hypothesis from dissolving entirely, because it offers a point of possible verification. As long as it remains untested, It serves as a kind of physical placeholder for doubt, but the weaknesses are just as glaring. There is no physical evidence linking Brueckner to a trafficking plan. No bank transfers, no intercepted communications, no forged documents, no photographs. John, the alleged accomplice, vanished and has never been found. Without him, the Campfire confession is hearsay twice removed. The slab, while real, is circumstantial. Construction projects are abandoned all the time. The lack of excavation is frustrating, but absence of testing is not proof of concealment. The hypothesis thus rests almost entirely on Ralph's testimony, and the danger of relying on a single uncorroborated witness is obvious. Another weakness is the investigative response. Police in 3 countries have reviewed Ralph's information and, while acknowledging receipt, have consistently declined to act decisively on it. One can argue this reflects bureaucratic inertia or political caution. But one must also consider the possibility that investigators know more than they can disclose. Perhaps they already evaluated the site with non-intrusive methods and found nothing. Perhaps they judged inconsistencies in Ralph's statements that the public is unaware of. Until files are declassified, we cannot know. What looks like neglect might in fact be informed skepticism. Taken together, the strengths and weaknesses place the hypothesis in the gray zone of plausibility. It cannot be written off as fantasy. The elements align too well with what is independently known. But it cannot be embraced as fact. The evidentiary gaps are too wide. It is, in other words, a theory worthy of serious consideration, but not of definitive conclusion. The practical effect of this grayness is paralysis. Authorities hesitate to act because the threshold of probable cause is not met. Yet the public continues to circulate the story precisely because the lack of action prevents closure. Ralph's hypothesis becomes both a narrative and an indictment, a reminder of what might be true and of what has not been tested. This leads to the broader question: what does it mean to leave such a hypothesis unresolved? On one level, it perpetuates the agony of uncertainty. Families, investigators, and the public remain trapped in speculation. On another level, it reflects the reality of long investigations. Not every lead can be followed, not every theory can be tested. Resources are finite, politics intrusive, and legal thresholds high. In such an environment, even potentially explosive leads can languish. But the most troubling possibility is that Ralph's is right, and by failing to test his claims, authorities have missed their chance. If the slab does contain evidence, then every year that passes without excavation is a year in which proof decays, witnesses disappear, and justice recedes. Conversely, if the slab is empty, then a simple test could have eliminated a major distraction years ago. The refusal to resolve it either way sustains a vacuum in which suspicion thrives. At its core, the Ralph's hypothesis stands at a crossroads. One path leads to collapse, excavation finds nothing, and the theory disintegrates. The other path leads to vindication, evidence is discovered, and Ralph's warnings become prophetic. For now, the case remains stranded between these paths, paralyzed by indecision. This is why the hypothesis continues to haunt the discourse. It is not just about what may have happened to Madeleine. It is about what happens when institutions hesitate, when witnesses lack corroboration, and when physical leads remain untouched. In the absence of new evidence, the only honest conclusion is to leave the hypothesis in suspension. It is a possibility, not proven, not disproven, but significant enough to demand attention. To dismiss it outright would be premature. To accept it without question would be reckless. The space between those extremes is uncomfortable, but it is where truth often resides in unsolved cases. And so the story closes, not with resolution but with the echo of uncertainty. Ralph's account could collapse under the weight of negative evidence tomorrow, or it could be vindicated by a single discovery under concrete. Until that moment, it endures as both a hypothesis and a symbol of what is possible, of what is ignored, and of what remains unknown in the most famous disappearance of our time.